Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back into a world that once shaped the fate of continents. A world of stone roads, marble temples, marching legions, and a civilization so vast that its shadow stretched across 3 continents. In this calm, slow-paced journey, we begin exploring the rise of the Roman Empire, an empire so powerful that for centuries people believed it would last forever. Imagine this for a moment. A civilization so dominant that its armies could cross mountains, deserts, and seas, and still win. A state so organized that even its enemies admired the discipline of its soldiers. A society so confident that it believed its laws, its culture, and its identity would outlive time itself. Yet this same empire did not collapse in a single day. It didn't fall in one night. Instead, it cracked slowly, quietly, painfully, over hundreds of years, until one day the world looked up and realized that Rome, the eternal city, was no longer eternal. Tonight we begin that long journey. Before the fall, we must understand the rise, where Rome came from, how it grew, and how the seeds of its decline were quietly planted in its earliest years, long before anyone saw the cracks forming. Rome did not begin as a glorious capital. It began as a cluster of huts on a hill overlooking the Tiber River, simple wooden houses with thatched roofs, smoke drifting slowly into the morning air, farmers and shepherds walking the same dusty paths day after day. Around 750 BCE, the Italian peninsula was a patchwork of tribes, Latins, Sabines, Etruscans living in small, scattered communities. Nothing about early Rome suggested greatness. No one imagined it would one day become the center of a vast empire. But the early Romans had something far more important than wealth or numbers. They had a culture built on survival. Life was hard, and the constant threat of rival tribes forced the community to stay disciplined, united, and fiercely loyal to one another. Their values were simple: duty, responsibility, resilience. Strength was not a luxury. It was necessary for survival. This mindset became the foundation of Rome's future success. Discipline shaped every part of early Roman life. Families were strict. Traditions were respected. Laws were uncompromising. Order mattered more than comfort. The Romans believed that a society without discipline would eventually destroy itself, and this belief became a central part of their identity. Later, when Rome built its legions, this same philosophy transformed ordinary farmers into the most formidable soldiers of the ancient world. Before Rome expanded across continents, it fought countless small battles close to home. Neighboring tribes raided them, Etruscan forces challenged them, and Greek colonies in the south competed for influence. Rome didn't win because it was stronger. It won because it learned. Every defeat taught the Romans something new. Every victory made them slightly more confident. Step by step, year by year, Rome grew not rapidly, but relentlessly. Rome's greatest advantage was its ability to adapt. Unlike other civilizations that clung to their traditions, Rome absorbed ideas from everyone it encountered. From the Greeks, They learned architecture, philosophy, naval engineering, and military formations. From the Etruscans, they borrowed religious rituals, engineering skills, and political concepts. Even from enemies, they copied weapons, armor, and tactics. Rome never hesitated to change. If something made them stronger, they adopted it without hesitation. This willingness to learn became one of the pillars of Rome's rise. Eventually, Rome crafted a political system unlike any other the Roman Republic. Long before emperors like Julius Caesar or Augustus existed, Rome experimented with a system where power was divided among elected officials and councils. The Romans believed that giving absolute authority to one person was dangerous, so they created a structure with checks and balances. It was imperfect, often messy, and frequently corrupt, but for many generations it worked. It allowed Rome to govern, expand, and maintain stability. At the heart of this system was a core belief: the state mattered more than any individual. Service to the Republic was considered an honor. The idea that personal ambition should be restrained for the good of the community helped Rome stay united through many early crises. As Rome grew, its military evolved into a machine of remarkable efficiency. Soldiers were trained not just to fight, but to think, to adapt, to organize, and to endure hardship. A Roman legion could march for miles, build a fortified camp before nightfall, and fight a battle the next morning without losing formation. Every movement, every formation, every command had purpose. The legion wasn't just an army, it was a symbol of Roman identity. Rome's rise was slow, but unstoppable. As the city gained strength, it began looking beyond its borders. Conflicts with powerful rivals like Carthage would soon transform Rome from a regional power into a Mediterranean superstate. With each victory came more territory, more wealth, and more responsibility. And with every expansion, Rome changed, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. Even in these early days, long before the empire reached its peak, the first small cracks were forming, cracks invisible to the people living through it, but clear to us, looking back across the centuries. As the decades drifted onward, the Romans found themselves living in a world that felt familiar, yet strangely hollow, as if an echo of former greatness lingered in every crumbling stone archway. Roads that had once pulsed with soldiers, traders, and envoys grew quiet. A traveler could walk for miles beneath open skies, hearing nothing but the wind crossing abandoned villas and fields left fallow. The empire still existed on maps, still had emperors, still collected taxes, but the machinery that made everything work had begun to rust in ways ordinary citizens could not quite name. In distant provinces, governors sent their reports to Rome less frequently. Sometimes the couriers never returned. Sometimes the reports arrived months late, describing raids, shortages, or disputes that no one in the capital had the strength or money to solve. And slowly, without any single dramatic moment, people stopped expecting Rome to fix anything at all. They turned inward to their towns, their estates, their families. A quiet decentralization spread like a slow fog. Trade across the Mediterranean shifted as well. The sea that had once been the empire's lifeline became unpredictable. Pirate activity increased. Merchant ships preferred shorter, safer routes, often avoiding ports that had once been bustling. Harbors deteriorated. Warehouses stayed half empty. The great grain shipments from Egypt, once essential to feeding the vast Roman population, no longer arrived with their old reliability. Scarcity did not strike all at once, but it crept in the way exhaustion does, subtle at first, and then undeniable. And yet, in the heart of Rome, people still attended games, festivals, and public ceremonies, even as everything around them dimmed. The city retained its old rituals, though the crowds were smaller and the laughter quieter. Senators debated policies with the same grand gestures, but fewer people listened. Marble facades hid cracked foundations. Lavish banquets served meat from regions the empire no longer controlled. Everything carried a faint sense of pretending that Rome was eternal, pretending that change wasn't already underway, pretending that decline could be postponed by simply not acknowledging it. Along the frontiers, the pressure increased. Groups that Romans once called barbarians, though many of them had lived near or within the empire for generations, were pushed westward by forces far beyond Roman control. Climate shifts disrupted farming. New powers rose in the east. Population movements cascaded like dominoes. Entire tribes found themselves displaced, seeking safer land, warmer regions, or fertile soil. The borders of the empire, stretched thin and defended by underpaid soldiers, struggled to contain these migrations. But it is important to understand that most of these groups did not march toward Rome with conquest in mind. Many sought refuge, not victory. They wanted entry into the empire because it was safer, wealthier, and more stable than the lands they came from, even in its weakened state. And Rome, recognizing both the opportunity and desperation, sometimes allowed them in, settling them as allies, farmers, or soldiers. For a while, this worked. New communities grew inside the empire, blending languages and customs. Markets reopened. Fields flourished. Children grew up speaking both Latin and their ancestral tongues. It could have become a new chapter in Roman history, a peaceful transformation into a multicultural world bound by shared prosperity. But the machinery of integration broke down. Bureaucrats mismanaged settlements. Local Roman elites resented newcomers. Promised supplies were delayed or never delivered. In some regions, commanders treated allied groups with suspicion. In others, they exploited them. Small misunderstandings grew into conflicts. A missed payment became a rebellion. A local skirmish became a regional crisis. The emperors who tried to control these situations often discovered that their authority did not extend as far as it once had. They issued decrees that no one enforced. They appointed generals who lacked loyalty. They demanded taxes that citizens could not pay. power slipped through their fingers like sand. Meanwhile, the people who lived ordinary lives, farmers, craftsmen, shopkeepers, soldiers, adapted in quiet ways. They learned new dialects. They traded with families who had migrated from distant lands. Cultural borders softened even as political borders collapsed. A farmer might live his entire life without knowing who the emperor was and not feel that it mattered. Through it all, the Roman identity remained, but it stretched and changed. What it meant to be Roman became less about citizenship and more about surviving whatever came next. The empire no longer felt like a single, confident body. Instead, it felt like a vast quilt fraying at the edges, held together by old memories and fragile hopes. And still, remarkably, life continued. Children played in streets where senators once walked. Bakers rose before dawn to prepare bread for shrinking markets. Teachers taught the writings of Cicero to students who wondered whether any of it applied to the world they lived in. The collapse was not a single breaking point. It was a long, slow breathing out, a centuries-long exhale. Even the armies reflected this change. Legions once forged in iron discipline and Roman-born loyalty now consisted of soldiers from every corner of Europe, Africa, and Asia. Their armor varied. Their languages differed. Their loyalty, more often, was to commander rather than an emperor. They served Rome, but their idea of Rome was not always the same as the one described in history books. Night after night, travelers along the frontiers could see distant campfires glowing beyond the walls, the fires of groups waiting, negotiating, or simply trying to survive until morning. Rome still considered them outsiders, but many of these people had already woven themselves into the fabric of the empire's future. And in that future, the line between Romans and newcomers would blur so completely that the old distinctions would cease to matter. The empire, without fully realizing it, was becoming something new, not dying, transforming, slowly, quietly, inevitably. And as the transformation deepened, the empire's great cities began to reveal signs of a world shifting beneath the surface. In places like Milan, Trier, Antioch, and Constantinople, daily life maintained a steady rhythm, even as political earthquakes quietly reshaped the land. Citizens walked through marketplaces where goods from distant provinces still arrived, though less frequently than before. They heard gossip about border troubles, about new tribes settling nearby, about unfamiliar rulers rising in remote regions. But for most people, these stories felt distant, as if carried on the wind from another world. In the countryside, though, the change was more visible. Large estates that had once relied on enslaved workers and endless resources now looked to local tenants who owed loyalty not just to Rome, but to the landowners who protected them. These landowners, who controlled food, shelter, and armed retainers, became more powerful than some governors. Slowly, a new social order took shape, one not based on Roman bureaucracy, but on personal ties and mutual dependence. a man might live his entire life within a few miles of his home, trading with neighbors, and fearing the news of approaching raiders more than any decree from the emperor. The emperors themselves changed frequently. Some ruled for only a few months before being replaced, exiled, or quietly forgotten. Their portraits, once symbols of stability, became markers of turbulence. Each new emperor brought a promise to restore Rome's glory, and each inherited a system that was no longer built to be restored. The world had moved on, and the empire struggled to understand what it had become. In certain regions, Roman officials tried desperate reforms. They reorganized tax systems, restructured armies, and redrew administrative boundaries. Some ideas worked briefly. Others collapsed under their own weight. The empire was simply too large, too diverse, and too stressed to be fixed by reforms alone. It needed time, centuries of it, to transform into the mosaic of kingdoms, cultures, and languages that would follow. Meanwhile, the newcomers inside the empire adapted as well. They learned Roman customs, adopted parts of Roman law, and shaped their communities around a blend of old traditions and new influences. Children grew up speaking Latin mixed with their ancestral dialects. They served in Roman armies, traded in Roman markets, and worshipped in Roman temples and churches. Many of them considered themselves Romans in every meaningful sense, even if older generations disagreed. Still, tensions simmered. Some Roman towns feared losing their identity. Others welcomed the new economic energy migrants brought. Certain military commanders trusted their foreign-born troops more than their Roman ones. Everywhere, identities blurred and boundaries softened. The empire was becoming a patchwork, sometimes peaceful, sometimes fragile. Religious transformations added another layer to this quiet reshaping. Christianity, once a persecuted sect, had grown into a unifying force across many provinces. Churches rose where temples had once stood. Bishops gained influence that rivaled governors. New theological debates spread from city to city, shaping how people thought about loyalty, authority, and community. For many, faith became the thread that held life together in uncertain times. Yet the empire's older traditions persisted as well. Festivals honoring ancient gods continued in some towns. Philosophers still taught the works of Plato and Aristotle. Old myths were retold by grandparents to grandchildren who lived in a world changing too quickly to grasp. The collision of old and new did not produce chaos, but rather a slow blending, an evolution of culture that even Rome's founders could never have imagined. Agriculture, the backbone of the empire, shifted in quiet but significant ways. New farming tools appeared. Crops changed, influenced by the tastes and traditions of newly settled communities. Trade routes narrowed, so villages learned to rely more on local production. Stable food supplies became more important than luxury goods. And when weather patterns shifted, bringing colder winters or drier summers, communities adapted, building storage systems or shifting to hardier crops. It was not heroism, that kept the empire alive, but the quiet resilience of ordinary people, far from the countryside, in the halls of imperial palaces. Decisions continued to be made, sometimes bold, sometimes misguided. Emperors negotiated with tribal leaders, offering land in exchange for loyalty. Some of these alliances led to decades of peace. Others fractured quickly, leading to sudden uprisings. The survival of the empire increasingly depended on the personalities of individual men rather than the strength of the system. One emperor might manage to stabilize the frontiers for a decade. Another might ignite tensions through arrogance or mismanagement. Hope and disappointment alternated like the changing seasons. Citizens learned not to place too much trust in any single ruler. Stability, when it came, felt temporary, as if borrowed from fate rather than earned. And all the while, life along the Rhine and Danube frontiers grew ever more complicated. The rivers themselves, once considered natural shields, now served as meeting points between cultures. Roman guards watched as traders, travelers, and entire families crossed the water. Some came in peace, some sought land, others carried tales of distant turmoil. These rivers, which once defined where Rome ended, had become boundaries only in name. Inside the empire, people sensed the approaching shift even if they could not describe it. Some spoke of omens. Others simply felt a gentle unease, like the quiet before a long rainstorm. But few imagined that they were living through the final centuries of one of history's greatest empires. To them, life continued, familiar, routine, and filled with small joys and challenges. And perhaps that is why the end would feel less like a collapse and more like a transition, one that unfolded slowly enough for people to adapt without fully realizing what was happening. Rome was changing, not disappearing. Its legacy was not fading, it was spreading, carried by countless hands into countless futures. As generations passed, the world that had once been unmistakably Roman began to adopt new shapes and rhythms. In the hills of Gaul, children grew up hearing stories of emperors they had never seen, stories told by grandparents whose memories felt like echoes of a distant age. Farmers plowed fields that had once supplied troops marching under the eagle standards, though few alive could remember such armies at their height. The empire's presence lingered not in its power, but in the traces it left behind, stone roads that still guided travelers, crumbling aqueducts that stretched toward the horizon, and the Latin words woven into everyday speech. In many towns, old Roman buildings found new purposes. A bathhouse might become a gathering hall. A villa, once filled with mosaics and marble columns, might be converted into a refuge during harsh winters. The stones were the same, but the lives within them had changed. This slow repurposing carried a quiet poetry. Rome's architecture remained, but the stories those walls witnessed were no longer imperial. And yet, there were regions where Rome's influence remained strong, even vibrant. The eastern provinces thrived with trade, scholarship, and diverse cultures. Merchants from Syria, Egypt, and Anatolia exchanged goods and ideas in bustling marketplaces. Silk, spices, and glassware passed through ports that connected continents. Scholars debated philosophy, medicine, and theology in cities that served as crossroads of knowledge. In these places, the empire felt alive, perhaps not as mighty as before, but still confident and deeply rooted. Meanwhile, in the West, the landscape continued to shift. As Roman authority weakened, new leaders emerged, some Roman, some not. A local commander might become the central figure of a province. A tribal chief might be granted a Roman title and asked to defend a region. These arrangements were often informal, born from necessity rather than policy. But they worked, at least for a time. Over the course of decades, these leaders forged their own identities, blending Roman customs with their traditional ways. A chief might wear a Roman cloak, but carry the sword of his ancestors. A governor might administer justice using Roman law while relying on the loyalty of local tribes. Slowly, a new form of governance took shape, neither fully Roman nor fully foreign. And yet, for all these transformations, the people living through them often felt more continuity than disruption. A farmer still tended his crops. A blacksmith still forged tools for his neighbors. A mother still taught her children the prayers of her community. The great movements of history unfolded so gradually that daily life appeared almost unchanged, even as the foundations beneath it shifted. The army, once the embodiment of Roman discipline, reflected this new world in its composition. Units stationed in the provinces recruited locally, blending Roman tactics with the traditions of those who joined. Some soldiers carried Roman shields painted with symbols from their homeland. Others spoke Latin mixed with the languages of distant forests and steppes. Within the camps, camaraderie developed not from shared origin, but from shared duty. Commanders adapted as well. They learned to negotiate with tribal leaders, to manage alliances, and to navigate landscapes filled with competing loyalties. A successful general needed diplomacy as much as military skill. And yet, even the most talented leaders felt the strain of defending borders without the resources once provided by the empire's vast treasury. As winter after winter passed, the climate itself became a quiet participant in Rome's transformation. Colder seasons shortened harvests. Rivers froze longer than before. Forests shifted, causing animal migrations that puzzled hunters. Small fluctuations spread over generations, influencing where people settled, how they farmed, and which regions became vulnerable. In some areas, famine struck. In others, populations moved in search of better land. Normally, Rome would have intervened, sending grain, providing troops, relocating communities. But now, such intervention was rare. The empire had too many crises to respond to every need. And so villages learned to help themselves, relying on local leaders and nearby allies rather than distant authority. Through all of this, the the sense of Roman identity softened like an old tapestry. People still used Roman measurements, followed Roman legal customs, and celebrated Roman festivals. But these traditions blended with new practices brought by newcomers. A feast might include Roman dishes alongside foreign ones. A household shrine might honor both ancestral spirits and Christian saints. The boundaries between cultures blurred, creating something uniquely mixed. In cities, stone forums that once hosted political debates now hosted simple markets. Traders laid out their goods where senators once walked. Children played in the shade of statues whose inscriptions they could no longer read. The symbols remained, but their meanings had shifted with time. And then there were the stories, the quiet, persistent stories passed from one generation to the next. Tales of Rome's greatness, of heroic emperors and grand battles, of roads stretching across continents and ships crossing shining seas. These stories became a kind of cultural glue, connecting people to a past they never knew. And though the details often blurred or drifted with each retelling, the essence remained, that they were part of something vast and ancient. Yet as centuries ticked forward, the weight of that legacy became lighter. Children questioned whether Rome had truly been as powerful as the stories claimed. Some wondered if the empire still existed in any meaningful sense. They lived in a world shaped by Rome, but not ruled by it. Still, Rome endured not in its armies or palaces, but in the quiet persistence of its ideas. Laws, languages, calendars, customs, these were the invisible threads binding the old world to the new. Even as political power slipped away, cultural power lingered. It seeped into villages, courts, churches, and marketplaces. And in this way, Rome did not fall so much as it dissolved, spreading into countless pieces that formed the foundations of the world to come. And through it all, life continued peaceful in some regions, troubled in others, but always moving forward with the slow, steady rhythm that outlasts empires. Even as the Western Empire weakened, the eastern provinces maintained a fragile vitality. Cities like Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria thrived as centers of commerce, art, and scholarship. Merchants moved goods from one corner of the known world to another, silks from the east, spices from India, olive oil from North Africa. Scholars debated philosophy and mathematics in quiet courtyards, their voices mixing with the calls of street vendors and the distant ringing of church bells. Here, Rome's legacy felt alive, its systems still functional, its people still capable of remarkable organization and creativity. Meanwhile, the West's decline progressed gradually, almost imperceptibly, like a long shadow stretching across the land. Military resources were spread thin along a border that could not hold back every pressure. Small skirmishes escalated into larger confrontations. Settlements at the edges of Roman territory were sometimes abandoned, sometimes fortified, and sometimes absorbed by migrating tribes. In this subtle chaos, the ordinary lives of civilians carried on, unremarkable yet resilient. People sowed fields, mended roofs, and continued traditions with little thought of the greater empire's fate. The empire's leaders tried to manage these pressures, often with limited success. Some emperors implemented reforms, seeking to improve taxation, redistribute soldiers, or stabilize provinces. Others relied heavily on diplomacy, negotiating with tribal leaders and granting lands in exchange for loyalty. At times, these strategies worked. At others, they failed spectacularly. The empire was too vast, too diverse, and too strained to be fully controlled by any single hand. At the same time, cultural transformations spread across the land. Christianity, once a persecuted faith, had become an integral part of daily life. Churches rose beside pagan temples. Bishops wielded influence comparable to governors. The population adopted new rituals and ethical frameworks, reshaping local customs. These changes did not happen overnight. They crept quietly, reshaping beliefs, priorities, and the sense of community, often before anyone fully realized the depth of the transformation. Social life also reflected Rome's slow evolution. Citizens and newcomers mingled, intermarried, and traded with one another. Children learned multiple languages, incorporating both Roman and foreign vocabulary into their speech. Craftsmen adapted techniques learned from distant lands. Farmers experimented with crops introduced by migrating peoples. Over time, what it meant to be Roman became less rigid. It was no longer tied solely to citizenship, birthplace, or political allegiance, but to participation in a shared system of culture, trade, and survival. Even the army mirrored these shifts. Legions included recruits from diverse regions, blending Roman tactics with the experiences and customs of soldiers from outside the traditional borders. Commanders negotiated constantly with tribal leaders and local authorities, balancing loyalty, pay, and strategy. The legions were still formidable, but their cohesion depended increasingly on leadership and circumstance, rather than the unbroken tradition of Roman-born troops. Through all of this, ordinary life carried on. Markets remained active, though the goods changed. Festivals and rituals persisted, though their meanings evolved. Families continued daily routines, caring for livestock, tending gardens, teaching children, while the empire around them gradually transformed. The collapse, if it could even be called that, was invisible in everyday life. People adapted, persisted, and lived, often unaware that they were witnessing the slow end of one of history's greatest political entities. Climate, too, subtly influenced events. Winters were sometimes harsher, summers drier. Rivers that once reliably transported trade and grain fluctuated in depth, affecting local economies. Forests and wildlife shifted in patterns unfamiliar to traditional Roman farmers. These environmental changes placed additional strain on communities, yet also encouraged resilience and adaptation, forcing people to innovate quietly without grand proclamations or dramatic battles. Meanwhile, The empire's symbolic center, Rome itself, became a city of contrasts. Some districts remained wealthy, with villas and baths still in use, while other areas fell into neglect. Statues and monuments, once symbols of enduring power, slowly crumbled, their inscriptions fading from memory. Citizens moved through these streets carrying on lives shaped by history, but also by immediate needs: trade, food, shelter, family. Rome was still a capital, yet it no longer projected absolute authority across the Mediterranean. Its presence was cultural, moral, and spiritual more than political. And through all these quiet changes, the sense of continuity endured. Roads, laws, languages, and stories connected generations to the empire's past. A child learning to count in Latin, a farmer following Roman seasonal practices, a soldier using tactics refined over centuries. These threads tied the present to the past, long after the centralized power had begun to weaken. Rome was not disappearing. It was evolving, diffusing into new forms that would shape the future long after the last emperor in the West had vanished. It is in this slow, almost imperceptible evolution that the story of Rome's fall truly resides. Not in dramatic clashes or fiery sackings alone, but in the gradual shifting of borders, the quiet blending of peoples, the invisible erosion of authority, and the persistence of life amid uncertainty. The empire did not collapse overnight. It dissolved over centuries, leaving behind traces in every village, every city, every river valley touched by its influence. In that sense, Rome's end was also a beginning, the foundation for new kingdoms, cultures, and civilizations. Even as one era faded, the echoes of Rome persisted in language, law, engineering, religion, and storytelling. People might not have recognized it at the time, but each act of survival, each adaptation, and each small community decision carried the legacy of Rome forward into the centuries to come. And in this quiet, pervasive manner, the Roman world continued, living on in forms no one at the time could have anticipated. Over the decades, the Western Empire became a delicate balance between survival and decay. Daily life persisted, yet beneath the surface, forces were quietly pulling the structure apart. Political instability, which had been simmering for centuries, became more pronounced. Emperors came and went with alarming frequency, sometimes assassinated, sometimes deposed, sometimes merely forgotten by history. Each new ruler promised stability, but the machinery of governance was no longer strong enough to deliver it. Decisions that once shaped provinces and cities now reached citizens as vague suggestions, and many lived their entire lives unaware of which emperor sat on the throne. Economic pressures compounded the challenges. Trade routes that had once been reliable became disrupted. Pirates threatened Mediterranean shipping lanes. Merchant caravans altered their paths, avoiding roads that had once been arteries of the empire. Grain from Egypt, vital for feeding Rome's urban population, arrived irregularly or not at all. Local production became increasingly important, forcing communities to depend on their immediate surroundings. Markets adjusted, merchants adapted, yet the empire as a whole could not prevent famine and scarcity from appearing sporadically in distant provinces. Military strain mirrored these economic and political difficulties. The legions, once a symbol of disciplined power, were stretched across ever-widening borders. Soldiers increasingly came from the very peoples Rome had once conquered, or who had never truly been conquered at all. Loyalty became situational. Soldiers followed pay and the authority of local commanders, sometimes more than the distant emperor. While the legions could still defend a province, their cohesion was fragile, relying on leadership, personal loyalty, and circumstance. The once indomitable Roman army had become something more adaptive, but also more vulnerable. Barbarian incursions intensified gradually. Groups moving westward due to pressures in their homelands began crossing Roman frontiers, seeking land, resources, and safety. Some settled peacefully, integrated into Roman society, and provided valuable military and economic contributions. Others resisted assimilation, raiding towns and challenging imperial authority. Rome's approach was inconsistent, sometimes accommodating, sometimes punishing. This inconsistency often led to tension and conflict, even among those who had been loyal allies for generations. Amidst these structural strains, cultural life continued to flourish in fragmented forms. Christianity's influence grew, transforming social structures, education, and governance. Churches became centers not only of worship, but of civic life, providing charity, administration, and moral guidance where secular authorities could not. Ancient pagan traditions lingered, sometimes blending with Christian rituals, creating communities rich with hybrid customs. Language, law, art, and literature evolved alongside these changes. Latin remained the lingua franca, but dialects, local languages, and influences from migrant populations enriched communication, blending cultures across regions. The environmental conditions of the empire also played a quiet but persistent role. Unpredictable harvests, floods, and droughts affected both urban and rural populations. Crops failed in some regions, prompting migrations or local unrest. Rivers, once reliable channels of communication and trade, fluctuated in depth and accessibility. Communities responded with ingenuity. New farming techniques, storage methods, and settlement patterns emerged. These adaptations allowed life to continue. Even as the empire's central authority struggled to provide resources or enforce law, urban centers changed in character. Cities once dominated by imperial administration, political debates, and bustling marketplaces became quieter, more localized hubs. Some neighborhoods remained prosperous, home to wealthy merchants or surviving patrician families. Others fell into neglect, with streets overgrown or buildings abandoned. Public ceremonies and games persisted, but were smaller and less grand. The outward appearance of continuity masked profound changes in power, economy, and daily life. Even in these quieter moments, the human experience remained rich and compelling. Families maintained routines. Tradespeople practiced skills passed down through generations, and children absorbed the knowledge and stories of their ancestors. These everyday actions ensured that Roman culture, law, and tradition did not vanish abruptly. Instead, they diffused into communities in ways both subtle and profound. At the frontiers, life was both similar and starkly different. Soldiers patrolled borders, negotiating with local leaders while defending against unpredictable incursions. Villages near the edges of the empire maintained their own forms of order, often relying more on personal loyalty than imperial decrees. Trade and cultural exchange continued across these boundaries, further blending Roman traditions with those of new peoples. Identity became fluid, shaped more by circumstance than by birth. Through all these quiet transformations, the Western Empire's decline was less a dramatic collapse and more a centuries-long evolution. Authority weakened, borders shifted, cultures blended, economies fluctuated. Life continued. And in this continuum, the legacy of Rome persisted, carried by ordinary people adapting to extraordinary circumstances. The empire's eventual disappearance from the West was not instantaneous, nor violent in a singular sense. Instead, it was a slow erosion, punctuated by moments of upheaval, occasional sackings, local rebellions, and political assassinations. These events were dramatic to the people experiencing them, but were part of a larger, subtle trend. The empire had transformed from a centralized power into a mosaic of communities, alliances, and identities, all bound together by shared history and culture rather than coercive authority. Even as the Western Empire faded, its ideas, institutions, and stories endured. Laws, architectural techniques, languages, and philosophies persisted, providing the foundation for the societies that followed. Christianity, blended with surviving Roman practices, became a unifying thread. Local leaders, once minor officials or tribal chieftains, carried forward governance structures adapted from Roman models. Roads, aqueducts, and fortifications remained functional, guiding trade, travel, and communication for generations to come. And so, in the quiet, incremental way of centuries, Rome did not fall so much as it transformed. Its centralized authority disappeared, but its influence remained, woven into the daily lives, traditions, and identities of countless people. The empire's physical and political presence diminished, yet the essence of Rome, its laws, culture, and infrastructure, spread quietly, shaping the medieval world to come. Over time, the pressures on the Western Empire grew more pronounced, though still often invisible in the daily routines of ordinary people. Economic strain became unavoidable. Rome had long depended on a vast network of provinces, each supplying grain, metals, and resources to sustain urban populations and armies. But as borders expanded, costs increased. Roads required constant maintenance, fortifications needed repair, and soldiers demanded payment. In some provinces, local administrators struggled to collect taxes. In others, citizens simply could not pay. Revenue became inconsistent, leaving the imperial treasury increasingly empty. At the same time, inflation quietly eroded the value of currency. Coins that had once purchased bread and clothing now bought less and less. Prices fluctuated unpredictably, sometimes spiking due to scarcity, sometimes remaining high because of corruption or delayed shipments. Ordinary families felt this strain directly, though they might not have understood its larger implications. Farmers sold crops at prices that barely covered expenses. Merchants debated whether journeys to distant ports remained worthwhile. Craftsmen adapted, often producing goods with cheaper materials or simplified techniques. Life continued, but with a growing sense of instability that could not be ignored. Military demands only intensified the economic pressures. The legions required constant funding, both for equipment and pay. Stationing troops along the Rhine, Danube, and other volatile frontiers was expensive. Recruiting soldiers increasingly meant hearing from populations who were not Roman by birth: Goths, Franks, Vandals, and other tribes seeking opportunity, safety, or land. While these troops often proved capable, their loyalty could be uncertain. Commanders depended on contracts, incentives, and personal bonds rather than centuries of shared identity. The old unity of the Roman army had softened, replaced by a system that was effective but fragile. Political instability compounded these economic and military challenges. Emperors rose and fell with alarming frequency. Civil wars erupted intermittently as generals vied for power, sometimes supported by foreign troops or provincial militias. Provinces often suffered as a result, facing temporary neglect or predatory taxation to fund campaigns elsewhere. Citizens and local leaders grew accustomed to sudden changes in leadership, which subtly undermined faith in the imperial system. The authority of Rome, once absolute, became something that had to be negotiated, enforced, or cautiously assumed. Meanwhile, migrations and incursions continued along the empire's frontiers. Tribes pushed westward due to pressures from other groups or environmental changes, seeking land, resources, and protection. Some were integrated peacefully, forming federations or settlements under Roman oversight. Others resisted integration, raiding towns, ambushing supply routes, and challenging local garrisons. The empire's responses varied, sometimes offering land and status, sometimes enforcing harsh reprisals. But no single approach succeeded consistently. The borders, once defended with relative predictability, had become fluid and contested. Even as these structural pressures mounted, ordinary life carried on in its quiet rhythms. Farmers planted and harvested. Merchants sold goods in the markets. Children played in the streets. Religious rituals continued, both Christian and pagan, blending traditions and creating new customs. Social bonds adapted, relying less on imperial authority and more on local networks of family, neighbors, and allies. Life went on, but with an undercurrent of tension that few could name. Environmental conditions subtly influenced the empire as well. Shifts in climate affected crop yields, river levels, and the distribution of forests and wildlife. Some regions faced repeated challenges, poor harvests, flooding, or drought, forcing communities to innovate. Grain storage techniques improved. Local trade networks expanded to compensate for disrupted supply lines. Adaptation became a necessity, not a choice. Through all these pressures, economic, military, political, environmental, the Western Empire changed fundamentally. Authority weakened, borders shifted, and societies became more localized. Yet the legacy of Rome persisted in countless ways. The language of Latin, Roman law and customs, engineering techniques, and urban infrastructure all endured. Roads, aqueducts, walls, and buildings continued to serve communities, maintaining connections across regions, even as imperial control waned. And perhaps most importantly, the transformation was gradual. There was no single day when Rome fell. Instead, the empire dissolved slowly, like mist receding over the hills. Small crises accumulated over decades. Local leaders adapted. Soldiers and settlers blended cultures. Trade patterns shifted. Communities found new ways to survive. And in this quiet, incremental way, the Western Empire transitioned from a centralized authority into a mosaic of successor kingdoms, cultures, and identities. Even as political and military power faded, the influence of Rome remained pervasive. Its culture, infrastructure, and systems of law guided emerging societies. Its language spread across new territories. Its religious traditions persisted, integrating with local beliefs. The empire's physical presence diminished, but its imprint on daily life, governance, and thought continued. In this sense, the story of Rome's fall is also a story of continuity, adaptation, and transformation. A civilization fading, yet living on in new forms. Over time, the borders of the Western Empire faced increasing pressure from groups that the Romans had once considered outsiders, barbarians, as the term of the time described them. Among the most significant were the Goths, the Vandals, and the Huns. Their movements were not sudden or inexplicable. They were influenced by climate changes, population pressures, and conflicts with other groups in the East. Yet to the people living within the empire, these migrations often felt like an unpredictable storm slowly sweeping closer. This final phase illustrates the nature of Rome's transformation. The Western Empire did not end in a single cataclysm. Its decline was slow, cumulative, and subtle. Centuries of economic strain, administrative fragmentation, migratory pressures, military adaptations, and cultural blending gradually eroded centralized authority. Symbolic events, the sackings, the deposition of emperors, were milestones milestones in a long process rather than instant collapses. Yet, the legacy endured. Roman law continued to shape emerging kingdoms. Latin influenced local languages and administration. Roads, aqueducts, and architectural knowledge persisted, guiding future communities. Christianity, now intertwined with Roman traditions, became a unifying thread in the post-imperial world. The structures, stories, and ideas of Rome lived on, diffusing quietly into the medieval world, even as the political entity known as the Western Roman Empire vanished. Life adapted, persisted, and evolved. Communities integrated newcomers, redefined governance, and continued daily routines. Rome itself, though politically diminished, remained a center of culture, religion, and memory. In this sense, the empire's end was not a disappearance, but a transformation, a gradual transition from centralized power to a mosaic of successor states and evolving societies, all carrying forward the essence of Roman civilization. Even after the Western Empire's political structures had largely vanished, the influence of Rome persisted quietly, subtly, and pervasively. Its roads remained, winding across the countryside, connecting villages, towns, and cities in ways that continued to facilitate trade, communication, and movement. Merchants still followed routes laid down centuries earlier, often unaware that they were walking the same paths as soldiers, envoys, and traders from a long-gone empire. Bridges and aqueducts, though sometimes neglected, still channeled water and linked communities. The infrastructure of Rome endured, shaping patterns of settlement and economic activity in ways no single conquest or political collapse could erase. Roman law, too, lived on. Local rulers, tribal chiefs, and emerging kingdoms borrowed legal principles, codes, and administrative methods from the old system. Courts operated in ways that reflected Roman practices, and written statutes influenced decisions in disputes over land, inheritance, and trade, while local variations developed and customary laws emerged. The structure and philosophy of Roman jurisprudence provided a foundation that stabilized society even as emperors ceased to rule. Ordinary people, even those far from the former imperial capitals, were indirectly guided by centuries of legal tradition. Rome's influence remained present in contracts, property rights, and civic obligations, quietly governing daily life. Cultural continuity thrived as well. Latin persisted as a language of learning, religion, and administration. Monks in monasteries copied texts, preserving classical knowledge alongside religious writings. Education, when available, emphasized Roman rhetoric, philosophy, and literature, keeping the memory of Rome alive even in regions now ruled by new powers. Art, architecture, and engineering, inspired by Roman principles, informed the construction of churches, fortifications, and public buildings. Citizens and rulers alike drew on Roman models to create order, beauty, and durability in a world that had become politically fragmented. Christianity, which had grown under imperial patronage, provided an additional thread of continuity. Churches and monasteries became centers of education, governance, and social support. Bishops often assumed roles akin to civic leaders, mediating disputes, organizing resources, and maintaining social cohesion. The moral and administrative influence of the Church, combined with inherited Roman traditions, helped communities navigate the uncertainties of post-imperial life. Religious festivals, rituals, and structures retained elements of Roman culture, even as new practices and local interpretations emerged. Even in warfare, Roman influence endured. Military tactics, fortification designs, and organizational principles informed the strategies of new kingdoms. Soldiers borrowed techniques, engineers built defenses inspired by Roman walls and camps, and rulers adapted the logistics of supply and communication, pioneered by centuries of imperial administration. Rome's methods did not vanish, they evolved, absorbed by new powers that emerged from its former territories. Daily life in this transformed world remained guided by these legacies. Farmers continued to use Roman techniques in plowing, irrigation, and storage. Merchants traded using Roman measurements and currencies, or derivatives of them. Local festivals reflected blends of pagan traditions, Christian observances, and regional customs, all shaped by centuries of cultural layering. Even as political borders shifted, people found continuity in familiar routines, patterns, and institutions inherited from the Roman world. In this way, the Western Empire's disappearance was not an end, but a metamorphosis. The political center faded, but the essence of Rome, the infrastructure, the laws, the cultural practices, the language, and the organized complexity of daily life remained embedded in the fabric of Europe. Communities adapted, survived, and built upon these foundations, shaping the medieval world that would follow. Rome lived on, not as an empire of armies and emperors, but as a framework for civilization, guiding societies quietly, imperceptibly, yet profoundly. And so, even in a world where emperors no longer commanded legions and cities, no longer dictated provinces, the spirit of Rome persisted. Ordinary life continued, informed by centuries of accumulated knowledge, practice, and cultural influence. The Western Empire had fallen, yet its enduring legacies ensured that the ideas, structures, and achievements of Rome remained woven into the everyday experience of generations to come. In this quiet, pervasive way, Rome's story did not end, it transformed, enduring through adaptation, integration, and the persistence of human life. As the Western Empire receded from political prominence, new powers began to emerge in its former territories. These were not empires in the Roman sense, with vast bureaucracy and professional armies, but kingdoms and principalities shaped by the blend of Roman legacy and local traditions. The Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Franks, Lombards, and other groups established their own authorities, often adopting Roman titles, laws, and administrative practices. In doing so, they created systems that were at once familiar and distinctly new. In the former Roman provinces of Gaul, the Franks gradually consolidated power. They relied on Roman administrative frameworks to manage cities, collect taxes, and organize military forces. Local leaders incorporated Roman law alongside customary tribal rules, creating hybrid systems that provided stability. Roads and settlements remained in use, facilitating trade and communication. Latin remained the language of learning and governance, even as vernacular languages began to develop. In this way, Roman practices persisted not as relics, but as functional tools for governance and community life. Similarly, in Italy, the Ostrogoths sought to maintain continuity with Roman traditions. They recognized the authority of the Roman Senate, used Roman administrative structures, and preserved civic institutions. Roman elites often retained positions of influence, advising Gothic rulers and participating in the management of cities. The blend of Gothic and Roman governance created a society where the empire's former structures guided the adaptation to new political realities. Daily life in towns and countryside continued with familiar rhythms, even under new rulers. In Spain, the Visigothic kingdom integrated Roman municipal organization and law with tribal leadership. Cities retained their administrative frameworks, public buildings remained in use, and Latin continued as the language of governance. Religion played a central role in legitimizing authority, with the Church acting as both spiritual guide and administrative mediator. Roman cultural practices, from urban planning to education, informed the structures of these emerging societies, ensuring continuity even as political control shifted. North Africa, once a vital granary of the Western Empire, came under Vandal control. The Vandals maintained ports and trade networks, albeit less centralized than Roman systems. Cities continued to function, and economic activity adapted to new rulers. Roman engineering, agriculture, and commercial practices persisted, integrated with the customs and strategies of the Vandals. Life carried on, illustrating the resilience of infrastructure and culture even amid political change. In these successor kingdoms, the influence of Rome was pervasive but subtle. Legal codes, municipal administration, tax collection, urban planning, and military organization all bore traces of Roman methods. Even architectural styles reflected continuity, with churches, fortifications, and civic buildings incorporating Roman designs. Roads, bridges, aqueducts, and ports, though often adapted or repaired, continued to guide movement, commerce, and communication. Education and religion reinforced this continuity. Latin remained the language of literacy, scholarship, and liturgy. Monasteries copied texts, preserving classical knowledge alongside Christian works. Bishops and religious leaders often acted as mediators, administrators, and record keepers, roles that mirrored Roman bureaucratic functions. Communities adapted to new political realities while retaining the frameworks that had long supported stability culture, and governance. Across Europe, the blending of Roman and local traditions created a landscape both new and familiar. The centralized authority of emperors had vanished, yet Roman legacies shaped the governance, economy, and culture of the early medieval world. People lived in towns and villages that traced their layout to Roman planning. Markets, fairs, and trade networks often followed the paths established by Roman roads. Legal disputes were resolved using principles derived from Roman law. Communities, though politically diverse, shared a cultural continuity that tied them to centuries of Roman experience. And through all of this, ordinary life persisted. Farmers cultivated the land using inherited techniques. Artisans and merchants maintained production and trade. Religious observances structured time and community life. Children learned Latin, history, and practical skills. Families navigated daily challenges while drawing on inherited Roman methods of organization, law, and social order. In essence, while the Western Empire had disappeared politically, its structures and traditions continued to shape everyday life across the continent. Rome, in this sense, never truly vanished. Its political authority may have faded, but its infrastructure, culture, legal systems, language, and knowledge remained embedded in the fabric of the early medieval world. The empire's influence persisted quietly, guiding the development of kingdoms, communities, and institutions. It had transformed rather than ended. Its legacy diffused across Europe in ways both profound and enduring. Life continued, informed by centuries of accumulated wisdom, adaptation, and resilience. A slow, steady continuum stretching from the ancient Roman world into the beginnings of the Middle Ages. Even as the early medieval kingdoms solidified, the imprint of Roman governance remained evident in countless, often unnoticed ways. Local officials, whether Frankish counts or Ostrogothic magistrates, relied on Roman models for administration. Town councils mirrored Roman municipal structures, with elected or appointed officials overseeing markets, public works, and local disputes. Taxation, while often less uniform, still followed principles developed under centuries of imperial practice. Roads, bridges, and aqueducts were maintained not only for their practical value, but because the systems themselves had been organized with Roman efficiency in mind. Law provided one of the most enduring threads of Roman influence. Codifications such as the Codex Theodosianus, though centuries old, remained reference points for rulers and judges. Local laws blended Roman statutes with customary tribal regulations, creating hybrid legal systems that guided inheritance, property disputes, and contracts. Judges and local leaders often referenced Roman precedents, and literacy in Latin enabled the continuity of legal documentation. In essence, Roman law became the invisible architecture of early medieval society, structuring interactions, resolving conflicts, and legitimizing authority long after emperors had ceased to rule. Urban life, too, carried the marks of Rome. Many towns retained their Roman layouts. Central forums evolved into marketplaces, and public buildings, often churches or halls, reused Roman foundations and walls. Civic spaces continued to serve as hubs for trade, administration, and communal life. Even when political control shifted from Roman governors to Gothic kings or Frankish counts, the physical and functional structures of towns provided continuity. People moved through streets and squares that had existed for centuries, participating in routines that linked them, perhaps unknowingly, to generations long past. Religion amplified these continuities. Churches often occupied former temples, adopting the architectural forms of Roman civic buildings. Monasteries preserved literacy, education, and record-keeping, maintaining libraries of texts that included Roman law, philosophy, and history. Bishops acted not only as spiritual leaders, but also as administrators, arbitrators, and intermediaries, roles reminiscent of civic officials in the late Empire. Through religious institutions, the organizational principles, cultural norms, and moral frameworks of Rome remained active, shaping communities and guiding daily life. Trade and economy reflected similar continuity. Markets followed routes established by Roman roads, connecting towns, villages, and ports. Standardized weights and measures, inherited from Roman practice, facilitated exchange. Craftsmen maintained techniques learned under Roman influence, producing goods with designs, tools, and methods passed down through centuries. Even in regions politically dominated by new kingdoms, the economic frameworks inherited from Rome allowed trade, production, and distribution to continue with remarkable stability. Education and culture, though localized, further reinforced the Roman legacy. Latin remained the lingua franca of scholarship, administration, and liturgy. Monastic schools and cathedral centers taught Roman history, rhetoric, and philosophy alongside religious instruction. Artistic styles incorporated classical motifs, adapted for new purposes in religious art, manuscripts, and architecture. Storytelling preserved legends of Rome, emperors, and military exploits, keeping the memory of the ancient empire alive in communal consciousness. Across these examples, the pattern is clear. Rome did not vanish with the fall of the Western Empire. Instead, its influence seeped into every aspect of early medieval life. Governance borrowed its frameworks. Law maintained its structure. Urban spaces continued to function according to Roman planning. Religion, education, and trade carried its practices forward. The empire's presence endured in the rhythms of daily life, often invisible yet profoundly shaping societies across Europe. Through this quiet continuity, ordinary people, farmers, artisans, merchants, and clergy lived lives, guided in part by Roman principles. Even when political boundaries shifted and rulers changed, the knowledge, organization, and cultural patterns of Rome provided stability. Communities adapted to new realities, yet the empire's legacy remained woven into the fabric of everyday life, proving that civilizations do not end abruptly. They transform, persist, and influence future generations in subtle, enduring ways. Over the centuries following the fall of the Western Empire, the influence of Rome continued to shape Europe in ways that were quiet yet profound. Roads, originally built for legions and trade, continued to connect towns and regions. Caravans, pilgrims, and travelers followed routes that had guided armies centuries before, carrying goods, ideas, and cultural practices. Bridges and aqueducts, though repaired or adapted, still enabled commerce and communication. In many places, the remnants of Roman engineering formed the backbone of transportation networks, ensuring that the scattered kingdoms and principalities could function and interact. Legal traditions, too, endured. Roman law became intertwined with emerging codes of the early medieval kingdoms. Local rulers relied on Roman principles when adjudicating disputes over land, inheritance, and contracts. Bishops, town officials, and community leaders often referenced Roman precedents when issuing judgments, even as customary law and tribal traditions gained prominence. The underlying framework provided by centuries of Roman jurisprudence continued to structure society. Justice, in this sense, was not abolished by the empire's fall. It evolved, guided by precedents and practices that had proven effective over generations. Cultural life in Europe remained heavily Roman in character. Latin persisted as the language of scholarship, administration, and liturgy. Monasteries and cathedral schools preserved classical texts, copying and safeguarding works of history, philosophy, medicine, and literature. These institutions became centers of learning, ensuring that the intellectual achievements of Rome informed the education of future generations. Art and architecture continued to borrow from Roman styles, whether in church mosaics, manuscript illumination, or the construction of civic buildings. Even motifs once reserved for imperial or civic propaganda, arches, columns, and decorative reliefs, were repurposed for religious or domestic spaces, creating continuity in visual culture. Urban life retained many Roman characteristics as well. Towns continued to follow the organizational patterns laid down during the empire. Central squares for markets, administrative buildings adapted from old forums, and streets aligned according to centuries-old plans. Public spaces facilitated civic interaction, trade, and governance, allowing communities to flourish even under new rulers. In some cases, old imperial structures, such as amphitheaters or baths, were repurposed or maintained as centers of community life. Life moved forward, but always along a path influenced by Roman design. Religion reinforced this continuity. The Christian Church, deeply entwined with the Roman world, provided structure, education, and moral guidance. Bishops and abbots functioned as both spiritual and civic leaders. Monasteries preserved knowledge, maintained libraries, and served as hubs of literacy and learning. Religious festivals, rituals, and liturgical calendars retained traces of Roman civic life, blending sacred and secular rhythms in ways that shaped society for centuries. The church became a repository of Roman organizational skills, law, and education, ensuring that Roman influence extended far beyond political borders. Even in daily routines, the Roman imprint was present. Farmers used techniques developed during the empire. Merchants followed trade patterns established by centuries of Roman commerce. Craftsmen maintained skills and methods inherited from Roman artisans. Language, law, and practical knowledge persisted quietly, guiding everyday life even in regions where political continuity had disappeared. The empire may have fallen, but its structures endured, woven into the very fabric of society. Across Europe, these Roman legacies enabled adaptation to new political realities. Kingdoms rose and fell, borders shifted, and societies faced environmental and economic challenges. Yet the knowledge, infrastructure, and cultural frameworks of Rome provided stability, continuity, and guidance. Communities survived, thrived, and evolved, often without conscious recognition of the Roman foundations beneath their feet. Rome lived on in the rhythms, structures, and institutions that allowed human life to continue and prosper. In this way, the story of Rome did not conclude with the fall of the Western Empire. It transformed, persisted, and guided the development of medieval Europe. Its roads, laws, language, art, and governance structures shaped societies long after emperors and legions had disappeared. Life carried on, quietly and resiliently, informed by centuries of accumulated knowledge, organization, and cultural influence. The empire's end was not an abrupt collapse, but a slow diffusion, leaving behind a legacy that would quietly shape the continent for generations to come. By the time Europe entered the High Middle Ages, several centuries after the Western Empire's political structures had disappeared, the legacy of Rome remained deeply embedded in society. Roads that had once carried Roman soldiers now facilitated trade, pilgrimages, and the movement of scholars. Bridges and aqueducts, repaired or rebuilt, continued to provide essential infrastructure for communities. Even in rural areas, the organization of settlements often reflected Roman planning, with fields, irrigation, and property boundaries following patterns established generations before. The physical imprint of the empire persisted quietly, guiding daily life without the need for imperial authority. Law continued to shape governance and social interaction. Roman legal principles influenced emerging codes across Europe. Kings and local rulers used Roman precedents to legitimize authority, resolve disputes, and regulate commerce. Municipal charters often reflected Roman municipal structures, establishing councils and offices modeled on centuries-old traditions. In courtrooms and town halls, Roman law served as a framework for justice, ensuring continuity even as political power shifted repeatedly from one ruler to another. Ordinary people experienced stability in their daily lives, relying on systems that had been refined over centuries of Roman practice. Religion remained a central conduit for Roman influence. The Christian Church, intimately connected to Roman traditions, preserved not only spiritual guidance, but also administrative expertise, education, and literacy. Monasteries served as repositories of knowledge, safeguarding classical texts alongside religious manuscripts. Cathedral schools educated clergy and increasingly laypeople, transmitting Roman cultural, philosophical, and scientific knowledge. Bishops and abbots exercised authority in civic matters, acting as intermediaries between local populations and ruling elites, much as civic officials had in the late empire. Through these institutions, Rome's organizational, legal, and cultural legacies were sustained and adapted to new social realities. Urban life reflected continuity as well. Towns retained Roman layouts, central marketplaces, public squares, and civic buildings adapted for religious or administrative use. Walls and fortifications, often Roman in origin, continued to protect communities. Markets thrived along roads and trade routes inherited from the empire, ensuring economic vitality. Craftsmen maintained techniques learned under Roman influence, while architectural styles, arches, vaults, columns, continued to guide construction. The physical and cultural framework of Rome provided stability, even as political authority shifted from kingdoms to emerging principalities and city-states. Trade networks persisted along Roman arteries, linking communities across Europe. Merchants used systems of weights and measures derived from Roman standards. Ports, many originally built for imperial commerce, remained active, supporting local and international trade. Goods, ideas, and innovations traveled along routes that had been shaped over centuries, fostering economic and cultural exchange. Even in the absence of central authority, these networks allowed communities to flourish and maintain connections across vast regions. Education and scholarship reflected the enduring influence of Rome. Latin remained the language of learning, law, and liturgy. Monks and scholars copied classical texts, preserving knowledge of history, philosophy, medicine, and engineering. Artistic expression drew on Roman techniques and motifs, visible in manuscripts, church decoration, and civic architecture. Storytelling preserved legends, moral lessons, and historical memory, linking communities to a past they may have never experienced firsthand. Through these cultural continuities, Rome's intellectual and aesthetic legacy remained alive. Even in everyday life, Roman influence persisted subtly but profoundly. Farming techniques, irrigation methods, and construction practices were inherited from Roman models. Social organization, legal frameworks, and administrative routines guided community life. Families, merchants, artisans, and local leaders operated within a system shaped by centuries of accumulated Roman knowledge, while political structures had shifted and kingdoms had risen. The practical and cultural patterns of Rome endured, quietly structuring society and ensuring continuity. Through these centuries, the story of Rome demonstrates that civilizations do not simply vanish. The Western Empire's political authority faded, but its infrastructure, laws, culture, and knowledge endured, diffused across Europe, and woven into the fabric of medieval life. Roads guided travelers, legal systems structured society, towns reflected centuries-old planning, and institutions preserved knowledge and culture. Life continued, informed by the accumulated wisdom of the Roman world, ensuring that its influence shaped generations long after the last emperor had disappeared. In this way, Rome's legacy was both subtle and enduring. The empire's fall was not a sudden catastrophe, but a transformation, a quiet diffusion of influence across time and space. Ordinary life carried on, guided by inherited structures, practices, and knowledge. The Western Empire ceased to exist as a political entity, yet its imprint on law, culture, infrastructure, and daily life persisted, shaping the medieval world in ways both visible and invisible, profound and lasting. As the centuries unfolded, the kingdoms and principalities of medieval Europe were built upon foundations laid by Rome. Monarchs and local rulers relied on Roman administrative principles to govern effectively. Even when dynasties changed or territories fragmented, the methods of record-keeping, taxation, and civic organization remained rooted in Roman models. Towns and cities, whether in France, Italy, Spain, or the British Isles, often operated with councils, magistrates, and civic officials whose roles echoed Roman offices. In this way, the practical knowledge of governance survived, providing continuity that bridged the gap between empire and medieval society. Legal systems drew heavily on Roman influence. Codes, statutes, and customary practices incorporated Roman principles of justice, property rights, and contractual obligations. Judges referenced Roman precedents to settle disputes, and local rulers invoked legal frameworks to legitimize their authority. Even as feudal systems developed, with obligations between lords and vassals shaping social hierarchy, the underlying structure of law retained a Roman lineage. Contracts, land transactions, and civic regulations often followed patterns established centuries earlier, providing stability and predictability in a world of shifting political boundaries. Urban life continued to reflect Rome's enduring imprint. Towns preserved street grids, public squares, and marketplaces influenced by centuries-old Roman planning. Civic buildings were often adapted from or inspired by Roman structures, serving as town halls, courts, or places of assembly. Markets thrived along roads originally laid for legions and trade, linking cities and villages across regions. Bridges, aqueducts, and other infrastructure facilitated movement, commerce, and communication. The physical framework of Rome provided the stage upon which medieval society unfolded. Trade and commerce remained structured by Roman innovations. Merchants relied on standardized measures, inherited currencies, and well-established routes. Ports, once hubs of imperial trade, remained active centers connecting inland settlements to distant regions. Roads continued to guide the flow of goods and ideas, enabling communities to adapt and prosper even in politically fragmented landscapes. Markets, fairs, and seasonal gatherings became focal points for economic activity, rooted in patterns established during the empire's long history. Education, culture, and religion further preserved Roman legacies. Monastic schools and cathedral centers transmitted Latin literacy, classical texts, and Roman-inspired knowledge to successive generations. Art, architecture, and literature reflected Roman techniques and motifs, adapted for new contexts in churches, manuscripts, and civic buildings. Storytelling preserved historical memory, linking medieval societies to the events, figures, and moral frameworks of Rome. Religion, particularly through the church, reinforced organizational structures, law, and cultural norms, blending spiritual guidance with practical governance. Even daily life bore traces of Rome. Farmers cultivated land using techniques inherited from centuries of Roman practice. Craftsmen produced goods following methods passed down through generations. Families, merchants, and local leaders operated within legal, social, and economic frameworks shaped by Roman precedent. Communities adapted to local conditions, yet the invisible structures of Rome continued to guide routines, interactions, and planning. Life moved forward, quietly sustained by the knowledge and organization bequeathed by the empire. Through all of this, the legacy of Rome acted as both a stabilizing force and a source of continuity. Kingdoms could rise and fall, borders could shift, and dynasties could change. Yet the practical, cultural, and intellectual inheritance of the empire endured. Roads guided travelers and trade. Laws structured disputes and contracts. Towns and cities remained organized along familiar patterns, and knowledge persisted through educational and religious institutions. Rome shaped the medieval world, not as a centralized empire, but as an enduring framework influencing every aspect of life. In essence, Rome did not end, it transformed. Its political authority faded, yet its infrastructure, law, culture, and knowledge persisted, quietly shaping societies across Europe. Ordinary life, though adapted to new rulers and circumstances, continued under the influence of centuries-old Roman structures. The Western Empire's fall was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual diffusion of power and legacy, ensuring that the achievements of Rome guided generations long after the last emperor had disappeared. In medieval Europe, traces of Roman governance were visible in the organization of towns and cities. Many settlements retained the Roman Forum as their central square, repurposed as a marketplace, town hall, or cathedral plaza. Civic administration often mirrored Roman models. Councils, magistrates, and local officials handled taxation, dispute resolution, and regulation of markets, echoing the administrative practices of the empire. Even when kingdoms changed hands or borders shifted, these systems provided continuity, allowing communities to function smoothly and maintain stability. Architecture reflected Roman influence as well. Arches, vaults, and columns appeared not only in churches and cathedrals, but also in public buildings and fortifications. Roman construction techniques, masonry, engineering, and urban planning were adapted for medieval purposes. Walls originally built for defense against invaders were repaired or expanded by local rulers, while aqueducts, bridges, and roads continued to facilitate travel, trade, and communication. In some towns, old Roman baths and amphitheaters were converted into public or religious spaces, preserving the physical legacy of the empire in everyday life. Roman law guided societal organization across kingdoms. Legal principles regarding property rights, contracts, and inheritance were integrated into emerging codes. Judges and local officials referenced Roman statutes when mediating disputes, ensuring consistency and fairness, even as feudal obligations between lords and vassals became dominant. The structure of law remained influenced by centuries of Roman practice, providing a stable framework that allowed communities to navigate complex social hierarchies. Trade networks relied heavily on infrastructure inherited from Rome. Roads, ports, and bridges ensured the movement of goods, people, and ideas across regions. Markets followed predictable patterns, and standardized weights and measures derived from Roman systems facilitated exchange. Merchants traveled along the same routes once used by legions and imperial couriers, connecting rural villages to urban centers and fostering economic interdependence. This continuity enabled local and regional economies to thrive despite political fragmentation. Education and literacy preserved another vital Roman legacy. Monasteries and cathedral schools became repositories of knowledge, maintaining libraries of Latin texts, classical philosophy, history, and law. Scholars copied manuscripts by hand, ensuring that Roman intellectual achievements survived into the medieval period. The Church provided organizational stability, guiding both spiritual and civic life, while promoting literacy and administrative competence. This educational continuity allowed medieval Europe to retain a connection to the past, shaping governance, culture, and thought. Even ordinary daily life bore the mark of Rome. Farmers employed techniques of irrigation, crop rotation, and storage, inherited from centuries of Roman practice. Artisans produced goods using methods passed down through generations. Townspeople followed customs and routines shaped by Roman calendars, festivals, and social norms. Communities adapted to new rulers, migrations, and changing political boundaries. Yet the practical and cultural foundations of Rome remained embedded in their lives. Across Europe, These examples illustrate a central truth. Rome's influence was enduring, pervasive, and often invisible. Political authority may have shifted or disappeared, yet the infrastructure, legal systems, cultural practices, and societal organization established by the empire persisted. Kingdoms, cities, and communities operated within frameworks shaped by Rome, drawing on its knowledge and experience to maintain stability and continuity. Life moved forward, quietly guided by centuries of accumulated Roman wisdom. In this way, Rome's story after the fall of the Western Empire was not one of sudden disappearance, but of transformation. Its political structures faded, but its infrastructure, law, culture, and daily practices endured, shaping the evolution of medieval Europe. The Western Empire ceased to exist in name, yet its legacy persisted, influencing governance, urban life, commerce, education, and social organization for centuries. Ordinary people lived, worked, and thrived within a world subtly molded by the empire that had once ruled it. By the time Europe entered the High Middle Ages, roughly the 10th and 11th centuries, Roman influence had evolved, but remained unmistakable. Kingdoms across the continent, from the Frankish realms in the west to the Italian principalities in the south, continued to rely on administrative, legal, and infrastructural frameworks inherited from the empire. Local rulers drew upon centuries-old Roman techniques for organizing territories, collecting taxes, and administering justice, even as political boundaries shifted and dynasties rose and fell. These frameworks provided continuity, allowing communities to function with surprising stability. Urban centers, though smaller and less densely populated than in the height of Roman power, preserved the imprint of Roman planning. Streets followed ancient layouts, forums evolved into marketplaces, and civic structures often occupied or incorporated Roman foundations. Town halls, churches, and public squares were often built upon old Roman sites, maintaining the spatial logic of imperial cities. Roads and bridges, repaired and adapted over centuries, facilitated trade and communication, linking towns to surrounding villages and distant regions. Travelers, merchants, and pilgrims moved along networks established by Rome, carrying not just goods, but ideas, knowledge, and culture. Legal traditions also demonstrated remarkable continuity. Roman law, integrated with local customs, informed codes across kingdoms. Judges and officials referenced ancient statutes to resolve disputes, particularly in matters of property, inheritance, and contracts. Even feudal obligations, which defined relationships between lords and vassals, were administered alongside Roman-derived principles. Legal literacy, though limited to elites and clergy, ensured that Rome's frameworks persisted as a guiding force in governance and social organization. The Church amplified and preserved Roman influence. Monasteries, cathedral schools, and episcopal centers served as repositories of knowledge, copying and safeguarding classical texts alongside religious manuscripts. Bishops and abbots often acted as civic leaders, mediators, and administrators, roles reminiscent of late Roman officials. Religious festivals and liturgical calendars incorporated elements of Roman civic life, structuring time and community interaction. In many regions, the church became the primary channel through which Roman organizational skills, education, and cultural norms continued to shape society. Trade and economy also reflected Rome's enduring legacy. Markets operated along predictable patterns, often established in Roman towns or at crossroads of former imperial roads. Standardized measures and currency systems, inherited from the empire or adapted locally, facilitated commerce. Goods moved along routes created centuries before by Roman engineers and planners, linking rural and urban communities. This continuity allowed economic life to flourish, even as political authority was fragmented, and local rulers exercised varying degrees of control. Education and literacy, preserved through monastic and cathedral schools, maintained connections to Roman knowledge and culture. Latin remained the language of learning, law, and administration. Classical texts in philosophy, history, and law informed medieval thought, providing intellectual frameworks that guided governance, scholarship, and cultural life. Artistic expression, inspired by Roman motifs and techniques, influenced manuscript illumination, church decoration, and civic architecture. Communities, though politically transformed, continued to live within the structures of Roman-influenced cultural and intellectual life. Even daily routines bore the subtle imprint of Rome. Farmers, artisans, and merchants followed practices and organizational methods inherited from centuries of imperial experience. Social structures, community rituals, and civic interactions reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge. Ordinary life adapted to changing political and environmental circumstances. Yet it remained quietly guided by Roman principles, demonstrating the resilience and persistence of these inherited systems. In essence, by the High Middle Ages, Roman influence had become an invisible framework supporting emerging European kingdoms. Political power had shifted, empires had fallen, and new dynasties governed diverse peoples. Yet the infrastructure, legal systems, cultural practices, and organizational methods of Rome continued to shape society. Life moved forward in towns, fields, and marketplaces built on the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Rome, though no longer an empire, lived on in the structures, routines, and institutions that enabled communities to survive, adapt, and prosper. As Europe progressed into the later Middle Ages, roughly the 12th and 13th centuries, the influence of Rome could still be felt in many aspects of daily life, governance, and urban organization. Towns and cities, now more numerous and bustling than in previous centuries, often retained the spatial and functional patterns established during Roman times. Central squares, marketplaces, and civic buildings reflected centuries-old planning. Streets frequently followed the lines of Roman roads, connecting neighborhoods, towns, and regions in ways that facilitated commerce, travel, and communication. Bridges, aqueducts, and fortifications, repaired and adapted over generations, continued to provide the practical support necessary for urban life. Legal systems had become more formalized by this period, but their foundations were deeply Roman. Local and regional codes, while incorporating feudal customs, relied on principles derived from Roman law. Courts and municipal councils often referenced Roman precedents, ensuring consistency in property disputes, contracts, and inheritance. Lawyers, clerics, and educated officials drew upon centuries of Roman jurisprudence, blending it with evolving local practices. This continuity provided a framework for stability and governance, allowing communities to manage complex social and economic interactions, even as political power remained fragmented among kings, princes, and city-states. Administration, too, bore the mark of Roman influence. Towns developed offices and councils that mirrored Roman municipal structures. Officials were responsible for taxation, public order, infrastructure maintenance, and regulation of markets. Even when local rulers exercised authority, the organization of administration often reflected the efficiency and hierarchy first established under the empire. These systems allowed cities to thrive and expand, serving as centers of trade, culture, and governance that drew upon centuries of accumulated knowledge and experience. Trade and commerce benefited from Roman infrastructural legacies. Roads, bridges, and ports, originally designed for imperial purposes, continued to support regional and long-distance trade. Merchants relied on established routes, standardized measures, and currencies, many of which had roots in Roman practice. Marketplaces in towns and cities became focal points of economic life, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture. Economic networks built upon Roman systems allowed medieval Europe to sustain growing populations, emerging urban centers, and increasingly complex commercial relationships. Education and scholarship maintained a link to the classical past. Latin remained the language of the church, administration, and scholarship. Monastic and cathedral schools continued to preserve classical texts, copying works of history, philosophy, law, and science. Universities, emerging in this period, were founded upon the intellectual traditions shaped by Roman learning and organization. Through education, Rome's cultural and intellectual legacy continued to influence governance, law, literature, and scientific inquiry, ensuring a continuity of knowledge across generations. Even in the rhythms of everyday life, Roman influence endured. Farmers applied agricultural techniques developed centuries earlier. Craftsmen produced tools, goods, and architectural elements based on Roman methods. Urban residents lived in streets, houses, and neighborhoods shaped by Roman planning. Civic rituals, festivals, and religious observances reflected blends of Roman cultural practices with evolving medieval traditions. Communities adapted to new political realities. Yet, the underlying structures guiding social, economic, and cultural life often traced back to the empire. Across Europe, this continuity illustrates the subtle yet profound persistence of Roman influence. While the Western Empire had ceased to exist politically, its infrastructure, legal frameworks, administrative models, cultural practices, and intellectual achievements continued to guide the development of medieval society. Life moved forward, shaped by inherited knowledge and organizational systems that had proven resilient over centuries. Rome, though no longer an empire, lived on in the very fabric of everyday life, quietly structuring the governance, commerce, culture, and social organization of the medieval world. As Europe approached the late Middle Ages, roughly the 14th and 15th centuries, the influence of Rome remained quietly pervasive, even as kingdoms, duchies, and emerging nation-states began to consolidate power. Urban centers had grown in size and importance, and their layouts often reflected the planning principles established by Roman engineers centuries earlier. Streets, squares, and marketplaces still echoed the patterns of Roman forums, providing structure for civic life, trade, and governance. Bridges and roads, maintained or expanded over generations, allowed people, goods, and ideas to circulate across vast territories, linking towns, regions, and emerging centers of power. Legal traditions retained a clear Roman imprint. Many of the laws codified during this period were derived from Roman principles, adapted to local conditions and evolving social structures. Courts referenced ancient statutes alongside contemporary customs, blending Roman jurisprudence with medieval innovation. Contracts, property law, and inheritance practices all bore the mark of centuries of legal evolution grounded in Roman thought. This continuity enabled complex societies to function, providing a framework for justice and social order, even as political authority became increasingly decentralized. Administrative systems continued to reflect Roman influence. Kings, princes, and city councils relied on organizational structures that had roots in imperial governance. Officials oversaw taxation, public works, and law enforcement, often modeling their duties on Roman precedents. Bureaucratic practices, such as record-keeping, accounting, and territorial management, drew upon knowledge preserved through the church, monastic institutions, and centuries of civic experience. Even as political boundaries shifted, the tools of administration, shaped by Rome, enabled rulers and communities to maintain order and continuity. Trade and commerce were sustained by the enduring infrastructure of Rome. Roads, ports, and river networks allowed goods to flow efficiently across regions. Merchants relied on standardized measurements, currencies, and market systems influenced by Roman practice. Urban centers thrived as hubs of exchange, often growing around former Roman settlements or along major routes first established under the empire. Markets, fairs, and guild systems drew on organizational methods developed centuries earlier, providing stability in economic life despite political turbulence. Education and intellectual life remained closely tied to Roman traditions. Latin continued as the language of scholarship, administration, and liturgy. Universities, monasteries, and cathedral schools preserved and transmitted classical knowledge, including philosophy, law, mathematics, and natural science. Roman ideas influenced the development of curricula, civic education, and intellectual debate, ensuring that the legacy of Rome continued to guide both thought and practice. Art, literature, and architecture similarly reflected Roman inspiration, adapted for new purposes in churches, palaces, and civic buildings. Even daily life bore the subtle imprint of Rome. Farmers applied irrigation, crop rotation, and land management techniques inherited from centuries of Roman experience. Craftsmen, artisans, and builders maintained skills and techniques passed down through generations. Families organized themselves according to social, legal, and economic structures influenced by centuries of Roman practice. Community rituals, religious observances, and festivals often blended Roman cultural patterns with local traditions, creating continuity across time and space. Ordinary people lived, worked, and interacted within systems shaped by a civilization that had formally vanished centuries before. By the late Middle Ages, the Roman legacy had become the invisible framework underlying Europe's political, cultural, and economic development. Roads, laws, cities, administrative systems, education, and commerce all bore traces of the empire. Life was guided by centuries of accumulated knowledge, organization, and cultural practice. Rome no longer existed as a political entity, but its influence had diffused across the continent, shaping the institutions, infrastructure, and social norms that would support the emergence of modern Europe. In this sense, the fall of the Western Empire was not an ending, but a transformation. Its authority disappeared, yet its ideas, structures, and innovations persisted, quietly guiding societies through centuries of change. The Western Empire's legacy endured in every town, court, monastery, and marketplace, proving that civilizations do not simply vanish. They evolve, adapt, and continue to influence the world long after their political power has faded. As Europe transitioned into the Renaissance, roughly the 15th and 16th centuries, the legacy of Rome remained quietly woven into the fabric of society, subtly shaping politics, urban life, and culture. Cities that had grown during the late Middle Ages often sat upon ancient Roman foundations. Streets followed the same alignments established centuries before. Central squares and marketplaces echoed the Roman Forum, and bridges, ports, and aqueducts continued to facilitate movement and trade. Urban planning, though adapted to new architectural styles, retained the organizational logic of Rome, providing structure for civic life, commerce, and governance. Governance in emerging European states continued to reflect Roman influence. Monarchs and city councils relied on administrative systems inspired by Roman models. Record-keeping, taxation, and law enforcement drew upon centuries-old organizational principles. Legal codes, increasingly codified, often referenced Roman law, particularly in matters of property, contracts, and civil rights. Even as nation-states consolidated power, Roman frameworks of governance provided a stable foundation, allowing rulers to administer territories efficiently and maintain continuity in public life. Trade and commerce flourished along routes and networks established under Roman engineering. Roads, riverways, and ports, though maintained and sometimes expanded, continued to guide the movement of goods, ideas, and people. Marketplaces in cities such as Florence, Venice, and Paris thrived, building upon the infrastructure and organizational methods inherited from Roman urban life. Guilds and merchant associations, while distinctly medieval in form, often followed patterns of organization, regulation, and apprenticeship that echoed centuries-old Roman practices. Commerce, education, and civic responsibility were intertwined in ways that demonstrated the persistent influence of the empire. Education and intellectual life drew heavily on Roman traditions, amplified by the rediscovery of classical texts during the Renaissance. Latin remained the language of scholarship, administration, and literature. Monastic and cathedral schools, along with emerging universities, preserved and transmitted knowledge of law, history, philosophy, and science rooted in Roman thought. Artists, architects, and scholars looked to Roman ruins, manuscripts, and ideas for inspiration, blending classical forms with contemporary innovation. Civic architecture, public art, and urban design reflected a renewed appreciation for Roman aesthetics, engineering, and proportion. Even daily life continued to carry subtle echoes of Rome. Farmers used land management techniques that had evolved from Roman methods. Craftsmen applied skills and tools inherited from centuries of imperial practice. Social organization, civic rituals, and festivals often retained patterns shaped by Roman cultural norms, blended with Christian and local traditions. Communities lived, worked, and celebrated within frameworks influenced by centuries of accumulated Roman knowledge and experience. Religion, too, perpetuated Roman legacies. The Catholic Church, which had grown alongside the remnants of the empire, remained a key institution in governance, education, and cultural life. Bishops and abbots functioned as administrators and civic leaders, continuing the role once filled by Roman officials. Church architecture, liturgy, and organization preserved elements of Roman design and administrative structure, blending them with evolving medieval and Renaissance sensibilities. In cities and towns across Europe, the Church acted as both spiritual guide and stabilizing institution, ensuring continuity amidst social and political change. By the Renaissance, Rome's legacy had become deeply embedded in the structures, routines, and institutions of European life. Roads, laws, city layouts, educational systems, and administrative frameworks all bore traces of the empire. Life, though transformed by centuries of change, continued to operate within systems shaped by Rome's enduring influence. The fall of the Western Empire, far from being a sudden rupture, had led to a long, gradual diffusion of its ideas, practices, and infrastructure, shaping the development of Europe for centuries to come. Rome no longer existed as a political power, yet its influence remained alive in the governance of emerging states, the organization of cities, the functioning of trade, and the rhythms of daily life. From the streets of Florence to the courts of Paris, from the marketplaces of Venice to the monasteries of England, the invisible hand of Rome guided society, providing structure, knowledge, and stability. Its legacy endured not as an empire, but as the foundation upon which the European world continued to grow, evolve, and thrive. As Europe moved from the Renaissance into the early modern period, roughly the 16th to 18th centuries, the legacy of Rome continued to shape political, legal, and cultural life. Monarchies, republics, and emerging states often relied on systems of governance influenced by Roman administrative models. Bureaucracies, record-keeping, and taxation were guided by centuries of accumulated knowledge inherited from the empire. Legal systems increasingly codified principles rooted in Roman law, providing frameworks for justice, contracts, and property rights that allowed societies to function with continuity and order. Urban life retained echoes of Roman planning. Cities expanded upon foundations laid centuries earlier, with streets, marketplaces, and civic buildings reflecting the organization and spatial logic of Roman urban design. Bridges and roads, often modernized but still following ancient roots, facilitated trade, communication, and mobility. Civic structures, from town halls to public squares, continued to draw inspiration from Roman models, providing spaces for administration, commerce, and social interaction. Trade and commerce were similarly influenced by Roman infrastructure and organization. Standardized measures, currencies, and market practices derived from Roman systems enabled regional and long-distance trade. Merchants and guilds operated within structures shaped by centuries of experience, allowing economic life to flourish. Ports and river networks, many originally built or enhanced by Roman engineers, remained central to the movement of goods and ideas, linking Europe internally and with the wider world. Education and intellectual life maintained their ties to Rome. Universities, monastic schools, and academies preserved classical texts and scholarly traditions. Latin remained the language of scholarship, science, and administration, while Roman ideas in law, philosophy, and governance continued to influence intellectual discourse. Artists, architects, and engineers drew inspiration from Roman techniques, blending classical forms with contemporary innovations to shape the Renaissance, Baroque, and Enlightenment eras. This continuity provided a cultural and intellectual foundation for the emergence of modern European thought. Even ordinary life carried subtle remnants of Roman influence. Farming techniques, construction methods, and social organization drew upon centuries-old practices. Civic rituals, legal procedures, and community structures reflected the frameworks established by Rome. Towns and villages, even when modernized, preserved patterns of organization and infrastructure that had guided daily life for generations. Families, artisans, and merchants operated within a social and legal framework that bore the quiet but enduring mark of the empire. Religion, particularly through the Catholic Church, continued to preserve Roman organizational structures. Bishops, archbishops, and other clergy acted as both spiritual leaders and administrators, overseeing education, record-keeping, and social services. Church architecture incorporated Roman forms and engineering principles, while liturgical practices maintained continuity with ancient traditions. In these ways, religious institutions served as conduits of Roman influence, ensuring that governance, education, and culture remained informed by the empire's legacy. By the early modern period, it was clear that Rome's influence had diffused deeply into European society. The fall of the Western Empire had not erased its imprint, rather, its laws, administrative methods, infrastructure, urban planning, and cultural practices persisted, shaping the development of kingdoms, republics, and states. Rome had transformed from a political entity into a foundational framework, quietly guiding governance, law, education, commerce, and daily life. The story of Rome, centuries after its fall, demonstrates that civilizations do not simply vanish. Political authority may fade, borders may shift, and dynasties may rise and fall. But the knowledge, structures, and cultural practices of a powerful civilization endure. Rome lived on in the streets of European cities, the frameworks of law and governance, the organization of trade, and the rhythms of daily life. Its legacy was invisible yet indispensable, a guiding presence that shaped Europe's transition from medieval kingdoms to modern states. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe was undergoing profound transformations, politically, economically, and culturally. Yet, throughout these changes, the invisible hand of Rome continued to shape the continent. Legal systems, in particular, bore the unmistakable mark of Roman law. Codifications, such as the Corpus Juris Civilis, preserved and studied through centuries, informed national codes, municipal regulations, and even early concepts of civil rights. Judges, scholars, and lawmakers referenced Roman principles to ensure fairness, consistency, and order, creating legal frameworks that could adapt to expanding states, urban growth, and increasingly complex economies. Political institutions also carried Roman legacies. Republics in Italy and the Dutch provinces, monarchies across France, Spain, and England, and later constitutional experiments in other regions, often relied on governance models rooted in Roman administrative thought. Councils, senates, and advisory bodies reflected centuries-old ideas of deliberation and civic responsibility. Bureaucracies evolved along lines inspired by Roman organization, enabling rulers to manage taxation, public works, and administration effectively. Even as political power became centralized in monarchies or diffused across republics, the principles of Roman governance provided a stable foundation for statecraft. Urban life remained intertwined with Rome's enduring influence. Streets, plazas, and marketplaces in cities like Rome, Florence, Paris, and Vienna reflected patterns laid down centuries earlier. Bridges and roads continued to connect regions, supporting trade, communication, and cultural exchange. Civic architecture drew inspiration from Roman engineering, proportion, and aesthetics, visible in public buildings, theaters, and bridges. Towns and cities were not only economic centers, but also hubs of governance and civic identity, organized in ways that echoed the infrastructure and planning of the Roman world. Trade, commerce, and economic organization were likewise shaped by Rome. Merchants relied on standardized measures, currency systems, and market regulations derived from Roman models. Roads, ports, and river networks allowed goods to move efficiently across regions and beyond, linking European economies internally and with colonies and trading partners worldwide. Guilds, commercial laws, and trading associations drew on organizational principles inherited from Roman practice, providing continuity and stability in economic life, even as markets expanded and globalized. Education, scholarship, and culture continued to preserve and build upon Roman legacies. Latin remained the language of learning, science, and law. Universities, academies, and private scholars preserved classical texts while integrating new discoveries from the Renaissance and Enlightenment. Philosophy, history, literature, and architecture were informed by Roman thought, principles, and aesthetics. Civic rituals, festivals, and public ceremonies often drew upon traditions established under Roman influence, blending classical heritage with contemporary innovation. Through education and culture, Rome's intellectual and artistic legacy continued to shape Europe's development. Even daily life, from farming and craftsmanship to urban routines, reflected centuries of Roman influence. Agricultural practices, building techniques, and social organization often drew upon methods developed during the empire. Townspeople, merchants, and artisans operated within frameworks of law, custom, and civic responsibility that were rooted in Roman precedent. Communities adapted to the rise of nation-states, expanding cities and industrialization. Yet the invisible structures of Rome guided social, economic, and cultural interactions in subtle but enduring ways. By the 19th century, it became increasingly clear that Roman influence had permeated the foundations of modern Europe. Legal codes, political structures, urban design, educational institutions, and cultural practices all bore traces of the empire, demonstrating remarkable continuity across centuries. The Western Empire, though long vanished as a political entity, had left a legacy that shaped the organization, functioning, and values of European society. Rome's imprint was everywhere visible in the streets, courts, universities, and marketplaces, and invisible in the rhythms, principles, and systems that guided life. The story of Rome illustrates a profound truth. Civilizations do not vanish entirely when their political power collapses. Instead, their knowledge, infrastructure, culture, and organizational innovations diffuse across time, quietly guiding successive generations. Rome lived on in the institutions, practices, and daily routines of Europe, proving that the end of an empire can be the beginning of a legacy that endures for millennia. Its influence shaped Europe's transition from medieval kingdoms to early modern states, from Renaissance cities to Enlightenment-era republics, leaving a foundation that would continue to guide governance, law, culture, and society well into the modern era. As Europe entered the 19th and early 20th centuries, the structures and ideas of Rome continued to exert influence, often quietly, beneath the surface of modern political and social life. National legal systems, shaped by centuries of codified law, still reflected Roman principles. Concepts such as property rights, contracts, civil obligations, and legal procedure traced their lineage back to Roman jurisprudence. Judges, lawyers, and lawmakers relied on principles developed over centuries to administer justice consistently across increasingly complex societies. Even as modern constitutions and parliamentary systems emerged, the intellectual foundations of Roman legal thought provided clarity, structure, and legitimacy. Political institutions drew upon Roman organizational legacies as well. Representative assemblies, civic councils, and bureaucratic administrations often reflected centuries-old models of governance, accountability, and civic responsibility. Constitutional frameworks, though modern in form, incorporated ideas of civic duty, public office, and structured deliberation that had their roots in Roman practices. Rulers, presidents, and legislators operated within systems informed by Roman concepts of authority, hierarchy, and civic organization. The empire's influence was invisible but present, guiding the functioning of both monarchies and republics alike. Urban planning, infrastructure, and public works continued to carry Roman imprints. Many European cities retained layouts shaped by ancient roads and Roman settlements, from central squares to the alignment of streets. Bridges, aqueducts, and port facilities, modernized with new technology, often followed routes established centuries earlier. Public buildings, courthouses, libraries, museums, and government offices borrowed architectural elements such as arches, columns, and domes from classical Roman designs. Even the aesthetic sensibilities of city planning, emphasizing proportion, symmetry, and functional organization, reflected principles first refined in the Roman world. Trade, commerce, and economic life remained influenced by the Roman legacy. Standardized measurements, contract principles, and commercial regulations derived from Roman practice provided continuity and stability. Roads, railways, and ports, sometimes built atop Roman routes, facilitated the movement of goods and people, connecting urban and rural regions. Merchant networks and market practices evolved over centuries, but they often relied on organizational structures established under Roman influence. Economic growth, industrialization, and global trade were supported by these enduring frameworks. Education and scholarship continued to preserve and expand Roman legacies. Universities, legal academies, and scientific institutions built curricula informed by centuries of classical thought. Latin, while no longer the lingua franca, remained central to legal, religious, and scholarly traditions. Philosophical, historical, and scientific ideas transmitted through Roman scholarship influenced the development of modern political theory, law, and governance. Art, architecture, and literature drew inspiration from classical forms, blending them with contemporary innovation to shape cultural identity and civic pride. Even everyday life carried traces of Roman influence. Agricultural techniques, property organization, urban infrastructure, and social customs often had roots in systems developed during the empire. Civic rituals, public ceremonies, and educational traditions reflected principles of order, community, and hierarchy established in Roman times. Communities adapted to modern challenges: industrialization, urbanization, political reform. Yet, underlying systems of organization, law, and governance bore the quiet but persistent mark of Rome. By the 20th century, the Roman legacy had become so deeply embedded in European life that it was often invisible, taken for granted, yet profoundly shaping the continent's legal, political, cultural, and social structures. Rome, centuries after its fall, continued to guide governance, law, urban planning, commerce, education, and civic life. The empire's political authority had vanished, yet its influence endured, quietly shaping modern Europe's institutions and practices. The story of Rome, long after the Western Empire had ceased to exist, demonstrates a timeless truth. The power of a civilization is not limited to its political or military dominance. Knowledge, law, infrastructure, culture, and organizational principles can survive, diffuse, and guide societies for millennia. Rome lived on in streets and cities, in courts and councils, in schools and universities, in markets and bridges. Its legacy was invisible, yet indispensable, a foundation upon which Europe continued to build, adapt, and thrive well into the modern age. Even in the 21st century, the legacy of Rome continues to shape Europe in ways both visible and subtle. Legal systems across the continent still draw upon principles first codified by Roman jurists. Civil codes in countries like France, Germany, and Italy, as well as the broader framework of European Union law, reflect centuries of adaptation from Roman civil law. Concepts such as contracts, property rights, obligations, and legal procedures retain a structure inherited from the empire, ensuring that justice is administered with continuity and fairness. Political institutions, too, bear the imprint of Roman organizational thought. Modern representative assemblies, senates, parliaments, and municipal councils often operate within frameworks that echo Roman practices of deliberation, public office, and civic accountability. Constitutions and administrative systems, while modern in form, incorporate ideas of hierarchy, governance, and civic duty that were refined during Roman times. Even international organizations, in their pursuit of structured governance and law, draw upon principles of order, procedure, and administration, first developed in the Roman world. Urban life in contemporary Europe still reflects Rome's enduring influence. City layouts, street patterns, bridges, and public squares often follow alignments established centuries ago. Infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, ports, and public buildings builds upon Roman innovations in engineering and design. Civic architecture continues to reference classical forms. Columns, arches, domes, and symmetrical planning dominate government buildings, courthouses, museums, and public spaces, blending aesthetic grandeur with practical functionality. The principles of proportion, balance, and durable design, first perfected by Roman engineers and architects, continue to guide modern urban planning. Commerce and economic life remain shaped by systems inherited from Rome. Standardized weights and measures, contract principles, and structured marketplaces provide continuity in trade and finance. Transportation networks, now enhanced with modern technology, often trace ancient routes that once connected Roman towns and cities. Guilds and professional associations, while transformed, echo centuries-old models of organization, regulation, and skill transmission. Trade, finance, and industry all rely on structures and principles refined over millennia, demonstrating the enduring utility of Roman innovations. Education, scholarship, and culture continue to preserve and evolve Roman legacies. Universities and schools uphold classical traditions in law, philosophy, history, and the arts. Latin, while no longer widely spoken, remains a foundation for scientific terminology, legal language, and ecclesiastical communication. Literature, architecture, and civic art draw inspiration from classical forms, blending them with modern creativity to shape cultural identity. The intellectual and artistic heritage of Rome continues to provide a framework for understanding the world, encouraging critical thinking, innovation, and appreciation for order and beauty. Even daily life, though modernized, still carries traces of Roman influence. Legal frameworks guide contracts, property, and civic responsibility. Urban infrastructure organizes movement, commerce, and social interaction. Public rituals, education, and community governance operate within systems that reflect centuries of inherited knowledge. The invisible hand of Rome shapes the rhythm of life, providing continuity amidst technological innovation, social change, and global integration. Globally, Roman influence extends far beyond Europe. Legal codes, administrative practices, and architectural styles informed by Rome have shaped modern governments, institutions, and civic spaces worldwide. From the United States Supreme Court to international law, from urban planning in colonial cities to modern universities, the structural, legal, and cultural innovations of Rome continue to guide human civilization. Rome, long after its empire fell, remains a silent architect of modern life. The story of Rome is a testament to the enduring power of human knowledge, organization, and culture. Civilizations may rise and fall, but their ideas, infrastructure, and principles can persist, diffuse, and guide societies for centuries. Rome lived on not as an empire commanding legions, but as a legacy embedded in law, governance, cities, education, commerce, and culture. Its influence continues to shape Europe and the world, proving that the reach of a civilization extends far beyond its temporal power, enduring through the structures, institutions, and ideas it leaves behind. Even today, the influence of Rome is not merely historical, it is practical, guiding the way societies organize, govern, and interact. Legal principles first articulated by Roman jurists form the foundation of modern courts, contracts, and civil rights. The very idea that law should be written, structured, and applied consistently comes from Rome, reminding us that fairness and order are essential to functioning societies. In this way, Rome's influence continues to ensure that justice, accountability, and social stability are more than ideals. They are systems embedded in daily life. Political life, too, reflects Roman lessons. Modern democracies, republics, and even constitutional monarchies rely on structures of governance that echo Roman ideas of civic responsibility, deliberation, and public service. Assemblies, councils, and bureaucracies, though adapted and modernized, carry the DNA of Roman organization, demonstrating the enduring value of structured governance and clearly defined roles. Civic engagement, the balance of authority, and the rule of law all draw on centuries of thought and practice that originated in the Roman world. Urban planning and architecture provide tangible reminders of Rome's lasting presence. Streets, public squares, bridges, and government buildings in countless cities worldwide reflect Roman approaches to order, proportion, and functionality. Infrastructure designed to facilitate trade, communication, and social interaction still guides modern life. The principles of engineering, durability, and public utility, perfected by Roman architects and engineers, remain embedded in the design of cities and civic spaces, shaping how people live, move, and connect. Commerce and economic life, too, continue to bear the imprint of Rome. Standardized measures, contracts, and structured marketplaces allow complex economies to function smoothly. Even global trade networks, though vastly more extensive than in Roman times, rely on the principles of organization, regulation, and trust that were first refined in the empire. Markets, contracts, and professional guilds, or their modern equivalents, demonstrate that practical systems of exchange and accountability are as essential today as they were 2,000 years ago. Education and culture remain perhaps the most enduring reflections of Rome's legacy. Latin language, literature, philosophy, and law continue to inform academic study, scientific terminology, and cultural understanding. Civic rituals, festivals, and the arts carry echoes of Roman traditions adapted for contemporary society. Through education, scholarship, and cultural expression, Rome teaches us about human ingenuity, organization, and creativity. Its legacy reminds us that civilizations shape not only their own time, but generations yet to come. Even ordinary daily life is guided by structures and practices that owe their existence to Rome. How communities organize, how governments function, how markets operate, and how cities are built. These are all informed by centuries of inherited knowledge. Rome's systems, though invisible in many ways, quietly provide the order, efficiency, and structure that allow modern societies to thrive. Roads, laws, schools, and public spaces are more than infrastructure. They are living reminders of a civilization that continues to shape our world. The story of Rome teaches a timeless lesson. The power of a civilization lies not only in its armies, conquests, or political dominance, but in its ability to create lasting structures, ideas, and principles. Rome fell as a political empire, yet it endured as a legacy, a framework upon which societies could build, adapt, and flourish. Its influence reminds us that the achievements of the past are not static relics. They are tools, guides, and inspirations that continue to shape the present and future. In this way, Rome lives on in every law, every city street, every civic institution, every school, and every marketplace. Its legacy is invisible yet indispensable, quiet yet powerful, ancient yet continuously relevant. The empire may have vanished, but its influence endures, shaping the rhythms, structures, and possibilities of human society even today. Understanding Rome's legacy is not merely an exercise in history. It is a recognition of the enduring principles that continue to guide how we live, govern, learn, and build our world. As we reflect on the story of Rome, it becomes clear that its legacy is everywhere, woven into the very fabric of our modern world. Roads that guide daily travel, laws that structure society, cities that organize commerce and civic life, schools that preserve knowledge, and institutions that govern, all of these carry echoes of a civilization that existed thousands of years ago. Rome's influence is not a distant memory. It is a living presence, quietly shaping the choices, structures, and rhythms of human life, even today. The fall of the Western Empire was not the end of Rome. Rather, it marked the beginning of a transformation, a diffusion of knowledge, systems, and cultural practices across Europe and beyond. What might have seemed like a collapse was, in reality, the foundation for centuries of adaptation, innovation, and continuity. Medieval kingdoms, Renaissance city-states, early modern nations, and contemporary societies all owe their structures, ideas, and institutions, in part to the ingenuity and organization of Rome. Rome's story teaches us that the power of a civilization is not measured only by armies, conquest, or political dominance. Its true endurance lies in its ability to create frameworks, legal, administrative, cultural, and technological, that survive the turbulence of history. Infrastructure, governance, law, education, commerce, and civic life all were tools crafted by Rome that continued to guide generations long after emperors and legions were gone. Even when political authority vanished, the principles, systems, and knowledge of Rome lived on. Today, we walk through cities shaped by Roman planning, live under laws inspired by Roman jurisprudence, study and teach ideas preserved through centuries of Roman influence, and participate in civic life structured by centuries-old organizational wisdom. The empire may have disappeared from the map, but it persists in the ways we live, work, learn, and interact with one another. Rome's legacy is, in essence, a bridge across time, connecting the ancient world to the present and guiding us toward the future. Understanding Rome's enduring influence invites us to see history not as a series of isolated events, but as a continuum where ideas, structures, and practices can outlive empires, rulers, and centuries. Rome shows us that the achievements of the past are not lost. They are inherited, adapted, and embedded in the world we inhabit today. Its story reminds us that every road, law, city, institution, and cultural practice has a lineage, a connection to human ingenuity, resilience, and creativity that spans millennia. So next time you walk through a city square, consult a law, engage with civic institutions, or simply move through your daily life, consider that you are participating in a world shaped in part by Rome. Its influence is subtle yet pervasive, quiet yet undeniable, ancient yet profoundly relevant. Rome, long after its political power faded, continues to guide humanity, its legacy, a testament to the enduring strength of ideas, organization, and civilization itself.